Welcome to this comprehensive journey through the history of Virginia, one of America's most historically significant states. From the ancient peoples who first called this land home, through colonial struggles, revolutionary fervor, civil war, and into the modern era, Virginia's story is nothing less than the story of America itself. Known as the Old Dominion and the Mother of Presidents, Virginia has been at the center of nearly every major chapter in American history. Today, we'll explore how this remarkable state shaped not just a nation, but the very ideas of democracy and freedom that would transform the world. So, settle in as we travel through time, from the misty forests of pre-colonial Virginia to the bustling metropolitan corridors of today, uncovering the triumphs, tragedies, and transformations that make Virginia's history so captivating. The first Virginians, ancient peoples, and pre-contact societies. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, Virginia was home to thriving indigenous civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests human habitation in the region dating back at least 18,000 years, when Paleo-Indians hunted mammoths and mastodons across a landscape that looked vastly different from today. By around 1200 CE, complex societies had developed throughout the region. The people we now call the Woodland Indians had established sophisticated agricultural systems, growing corn, beans, and squash in carefully managed fields. They built substantial villages, created intricate pottery, and developed extensive trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The Powhatan Confederacy. By the time Europeans arrived, the most powerful political entity in the Tidewater region was the Powhatan Confederacy. This wasn't a single tribe, but rather an alliance of approximately 30 Algonquian-speaking groups united under the leadership of a paramount chief called Wahunsenacawh, whom the English would simply call Powhatan. The Powhatan Confederacy controlled most of the coastal plain between the Potomac River and the Great Dismal Swamp, encompassing perhaps 15,000 people. These weren't the primitive peoples that European propaganda would later portray, but rather sophisticated societies with complex political structures, established agricultural practices, and rich cultural traditions. Their villages consisted of barrel-roofed houses called yehakins, made from saplings and covered with woven mats or bark. The Powhatans practiced a mixed economy of agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Women tended the fields while men hunted and fished. They had a deep spiritual connection to the land, viewing themselves not as its owners, but as its caretakers. Other indigenous groups. Beyond the Powhatan Confederacy, other significant groups inhabited Virginia. The Monacan people controlled the Piedmont region along the James River. The Cherokee held territory in the southwestern mountains. The Nottoway and Meherrin lived in the southeastern regions. Each group had its own distinct culture, language, and traditions, creating a rich tapestry of indigenous life that had flourished for millennia. The colonial experiment begins. First encounters and failed attempts. The first documented European contact with Virginia came in 1570 when Spanish Jesuits attempted to establish a mission on the York River. The mission failed spectacularly when it was destroyed by local Indians, including a young man named Don Luis, who had been educated in Spain and Mexico, but ultimately chose to return to his people. The English made their first serious attempt at colonization in 1585 with the Roanoke colony. located in what is now North Carolina, but was then considered part of Virginia. This famous lost colony disappeared without a trace, leaving only the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a post, a mystery that haunts American history to this day. Jamestown, the struggle for survival. On May 14th, 1607, three ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, landed on a marshy peninsula along the James River. The 104 English colonists who disembarked would establish Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. But permanence was far from guaranteed. The colonists, many of them gentlemen unused to manual labor, were woefully unprepared for the challenges they faced. They had chosen the site for its defensive position against Spanish attack, but the location was a disaster for human habitation. Swampy, mosquito-infested, and with brackish water unsuitable for drinking. The first years were catastrophic. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatans decimated the colony. During the winter of 1609-1610, known as the Starving Time, the population plummeted from 500 to just 60 survivors. Desperate colonists resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, rats, and in at least one documented case, cannibalism. John Smith and Pocahontas. The colony might have failed entirely if not for Captain John Smith, whose military discipline and practical approach to survival helped stabilize the situation. Smith enforced the rule, "He who does not work does not eat," and established crucial, if tense, trading relationships with the Powhatans. The story of Smith and Pocahontas has become American legend, though the reality was far different from Disney's portrayal. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matoaka, was about 11 years old when she first encountered the colonists. Whether she actually saved Smith's life, or whether this was a ritual adoption ceremony, remains debated by historians. What is certain is that Pocahontas became a crucial intermediary between the two cultures. Her marriage to tobacco planter John Rolfe in 1614 created a brief period of peace between the colonists and the Powhatans. Her conversion to Christianity and trip to England, where she was presented as a civilized savage, became powerful propaganda for the colonial enterprise. The Tobacco Revolution. The introduction of tobacco cultivation transformed Virginia from a failing colony into an economic powerhouse. John Rolfe's development of a mild strain of tobacco that appealed to European tastes created Virginia's first profitable export. By 1619, tobacco exports had reached 20,000 pounds. By 1628, they exceeded 500,000 pounds. Tobacco was both blessing and curse. It brought wealth, but depleted soil rapidly, driving constant expansion into Indian lands. It required intensive labor, setting the stage for one of history's greatest moral catastrophes. 1619, a pivotal year, the year 1619, marked three developments that would shape not just Virginia, but all of American history. First, the House of Burgesses convened on July 30th, becoming the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas. This planted the seeds of democratic self-governance that would eventually flower into revolution. Second, a ship arrived carrying 20 and odd Africans, the first recorded Africans in English America. Initially, their legal status was ambiguous. Some may have been treated as indentured servants rather than slaves. But this moment marked the beginning of slavery in English America, a system that would define and divide the nation for centuries. Third, a ship arrived carrying 90 young women, recruited to become wives for the colonists. Their arrival marked the transition from temporary exploitation colony to permanent settlement as families began to establish roots in Virginia soil. Growth and conflict, the Indian Wars. As tobacco cultivation expanded, so did conflict with Virginia's indigenous peoples. The death of Pocahontas in 1617 and of Powhatan in 1618 removed crucial voices for peace. Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, took a harder line against English encroachment. On March 22, 1622, Opechancanough launched a coordinated attack on English settlements, killing 347 colonists, roughly a quarter of the English population. The attack shocked the colonists, but ultimately sealed the fate of the Powhatans. The English retaliated with genocidal fury, conducting annual campaigns to burn Indian towns and crops. A second major uprising in 1644, again led by Opechancanough, now elderly and blind, killed another 400 colonists, but failed to dislodge the English. Opechancanough was captured and murdered while in custody. The surviving Powhatans were forced onto small reservations, their confederacy shattered. The evolution of slavery. As Virginia's tobacco economy expanded, the labor system evolved from indentured servitude toward racial slavery. Initially, both Europeans and Africans worked as indentured servants, earning freedom after a period of service. Some Africans, like Anthony and Mary Johnson, gained freedom, owned land, and even held slaves themselves. But by the 1640s, distinctions emerged. Court records show Africans receiving lifetime servitude for crimes that brought Europeans only extended indentures. In 1662, Virginia law dictated that children would follow the condition of their mothers, ensuring that enslaved women's children would remain enslaved. By 1705, the Virginia Slave Code had created a comprehensive legal framework for racial slavery. This transformation wasn't inevitable, but resulted from deliberate choices by Virginia's planter elite. They chose racial slavery over other labor systems because it provided a permanent, controllable workforce and prevented alliances between poor whites and Africans that might threaten elite power. Bacon's Rebellion. Those class tensions exploded in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion, a complex uprising that revealed deep fractures in Virginia society. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy planter, mobilized frontiersmen angry about Indian attacks and lack of representation against Governor William Berkeley's administration. The rebellion began as an unauthorized war against Indians, but evolved into a broader challenge to colonial authority. Bacon's forces, including both white indentured servants and enslaved Africans, burned Jamestown to the ground. The rebellion collapsed when Bacon died of dysentery, but it had lasting consequences. The planter elite, terrified by the alliance between poor whites and Africans, consciously worked to divide them. They extended political rights to poor whites while further entrenching racial slavery. This racial bribe would shape American society for centuries. The move to Williamsburg. In 1699, Virginia's capital moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg, marking both practical and symbolic change. Williamsburg, with its planned layout and grand public buildings, represented Virginia's evolution from struggling outpost to established colony. The College of William and Mary, founded in 1693, made it a center of learning and culture. The golden age of colonial Virginia. The Tidewater aristocracy. By the 18th century, Virginia had developed a distinct aristocratic culture centered on great plantations along the Tidewater rivers. Families like the Carters, Lees, Randolphs, and Byrds created a world of elegant mansions, formal gardens, and refined society consciously modeled on English country life. These great planters dominated Virginia politically, economically, and socially. They controlled the House of Burgesses, served as county justices, and commanded the militia. Their wealth came from thousands of acres worked by hundreds of enslaved Africans. Robert King Carter owned 300,000 acres and 1,000 slaves at his death in 1732. This was the world that produced George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other founding fathers. They were educated in Enlightenment philosophy, trained in self-governance, and steeped in ideals of liberty, even as they held hundreds in bondage, a contradiction they recognized but couldn't resolve. Daily life in colonial Virginia, beyond the great plantations. Most white Virginians were small farmers, working modest holdings with their families. They grew tobacco for market and corn for sustenance, owned few or no slaves, and lived in simple wooden houses in towns like Norfolk, Alexandria, and Fredericksburg. Merchants, craftsmen, and professionals created a middle class. Taverns served as social centers where all classes mingled, discussing politics, conducting business, and sharing news. For the enslaved, life was marked by brutality and exploitation, but also by resilience and resistance. They created families despite the constant threat of separation, maintained African cultural traditions, and developed new forms of music, religion, and cuisine that would profoundly influence American culture. They resisted through work, slowdowns, sabotage, escape attempts, and occasional revolts. The Great Awakening. The 1740s brought religious revival that challenged Virginia's established order. The Great Awakening, with its emphasis on personal salvation and emotional worship, appealed especially to those excluded from power, poor whites and enslaved Africans, Baptist and Methodist preachers, often lacking formal education, challenged the Anglican establishment. They criticized the planter elite's worldliness and sometimes questioned slavery itself. The movement created new spaces for African American religiosity and laid groundwork for future anti-slavery sentiment. The French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, began in Virginia's western frontier when young George Washington's expedition to the Ohio Valley sparked conflict between British and French empires. Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity and his role in the disastrous Braddock expedition gained him military experience that would prove crucial in the Revolution. The war's end brought new tensions. Britain's proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians, angered Virginians who saw western lands as their rightful domain. British attempts to tax colonists to pay war debts sparked resistance that would culminate in revolution. Revolution and the birth of a nation. The road to revolution. Virginia's resistance to British authority began with principle and evolved into revolution. The Stamp Act of 1765 prompted the House of Burgesses to pass the Virginia Resolves, asserting that only Virginia's legislature could tax Virginians. Patrick Henry's fiery speech, which may or may not have included "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," electrified resistance. When the Burgesses were dissolved by the royal governor in 1769, members met illegally at Raleigh Tavern to organize boycotts of British goods. These extra-legal meetings evolved into Virginia conventions that gradually assumed governmental functions. Virginians played crucial roles in continental resistance. George Washington represented Virginia at continental congresses. Richard Henry Lee introduced the Resolution for Independence. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, distilling Enlightenment philosophy into revolutionary prose that would inspire freedom movements worldwide. The Revolutionary War in Virginia. Initially, the Revolutionary War barely touched Virginia, but in 1779, the British shifted strategy southward. British forces raided Hampton Roads, and in 1781, turncoat Benedict Arnold led raids up the James River, burning Richmond. The war's climax came in Virginia. Lord Cornwallis, after campaigns in the Carolinas, moved into Virginia, pursued by Lafayette's Continental forces. Cornwallis fortified Yorktown, expecting naval support. Instead, the French fleet's victory at the Battle of the Capes trapped him. Washington and French commander Rochambeau marched their combined armies from New York to Virginia in a brilliant strategic deception. The Siege of Yorktown, September-October 1781, ended with Cornwallis's surrender on October 19th, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. Creating the Constitution. Virginians dominated the creation of the new nation. The Virginia Plan, drafted by James Madison, provided the Constitutional Convention's working blueprint. Madison's detailed preparation and brilliant advocacy earned him the title Father of the Constitution. Virginia's ratification debate in 1788 was perhaps the most consequential. Federalists, Madison and John Marshall, faced anti-Federalists Patrick Henry and George Mason in epic debates. Virginia's ratification, by a narrow 89-79 vote, proved crucial for the Constitution's success. Madison then drafted the Bill of Rights, fulfilling promises made during ratification debates and addressing anti-Federalist concerns about federal power. The Virginia Dynasty, from 1789 to 1825, Virginians held the presidency for all but 4 years. Washington established crucial precedents: peaceful transfer of power, 2-term limit, neutrality in foreign affairs. Jefferson engineered the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size. Madison led the nation through the War of 1812. Monroe articulated the Monroe Doctrine, asserting American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. These presidents embodied the Virginia ideal of enlightened, disinterested public service. Yet they also embodied its central contradiction, proclaiming universal liberty while maintaining slavery. Antebellum Virginia, growth and division, economic and social changes. By 1800, Virginia's tobacco economy was in crisis. Centuries of tobacco cultivation had exhausted Tidewater soils. Many planters shifted to mixed farming, wheat, corn, and livestock. Others moved to fresh lands in the Cotton South, often taking enslaved workers with them, breaking up families in what enslaved people called the Second Middle Passage. This economic decline coincided with philosophical challenges to slavery. Some Virginians, influenced by revolutionary ideals and evangelical religion, questioned slavery's morality. Manumissions increased, creating a significant free black population, especially in cities like Richmond and Alexandria. But most whites, even those troubled by slavery, couldn't imagine racial equality. The American Colonization Society, supported by many prominent Virginians, including Madison and Monroe, promoted sending free blacks to Africa, a solution that satisfied neither abolitionists nor enslaved people, who correctly saw America as their home. Gabriel's Rebellion and Nat Turner's Revolt. Enslaved Virginians didn't wait for the white benevolence. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser, an enslaved blacksmith, organized a sophisticated conspiracy to seize Richmond. Hundreds joined his plan to kill whites, seize weapons, and hold Governor James Monroe hostage. The plot failed when storms delayed the uprising and informants revealed the plan. 26 conspirators were executed. Nat Turner's 1831 revolt in Southampton County was bloodier and more consequential. Turner, a preacher who experienced religious visions, led a band that killed 55 whites before being suppressed. The revolt terrorized white Virginia. In retaliation, white mobs killed hundreds of blacks, most uninvolved in the revolt. Turner's revolt ended Virginia's anti-slavery discussion. The legislature debated abolition in 1831 to 32, but ultimately chose to strengthen slavery. New laws prohibited teaching slaves to read, restricted religious meetings, and tightened controls on free blacks. Western Virginia's different path. Virginia west of the Blue Ridge developed differently from the Tidewater and Piedmont. The Valley and Trans-Allegheny regions had fewer slaves, smaller farms, and more diverse economies, including manufacturing and mining. Western Virginians increasingly resented Eastern domination of state government. The 1829-1830 Constitutional Convention revealed deep divisions. Western delegates demanded democratic reforms, universal white male suffrage, and legislative reapportionment. Eastern elites, fearing loss of power and potential anti-slavery legislation, made minimal concessions. These tensions would explode during the Civil War, leading to West Virginia's creation. Cultural and intellectual life. Despite economic decline, antebellum Virginia maintained cultural vitality. The University of Virginia, founded by Jefferson in 1819, pioneered educational innovation with its elective system and honor code. Richmond developed into a literary center, home to the Southern Literary Messenger and Edgar Allan Poe. Virginia's springs, White Sulphur, Hot Springs, Warm Springs, became fashionable resorts where Southern elites gathered, reinforcing regional identity and political connections that would prove crucial during secession. Civil War, the Great Catastrophe, secession, and division. Virginia initially rejected secession. The February 1861 convention voted against leaving the Union, but Lincoln's call for troops after Fort Sumter changed everything. Virginia wouldn't fight against sister Southern states. On April 17, 1861, the convention voted 88 to 55 for secession. The decision split Virginia. Northwestern counties, with few slaves and strong Union sentiment, refused to accept secession. Meeting in Wheeling, they formed the Restored Government of Virginia, eventually creating West Virginia. In 1863, the only state formed by seceding from a Confederate state. Richmond became the Confederate capital, making Virginia the war's primary battlefield. More battles were fought in Virginia than any other state. The 100 miles between Washington and Richmond became the war's most contested ground. Major campaigns and battles. The war's first major battle at Manassas, Bull Run, in July 1861 shattered illusions of quick victory. Confederate victory sent Union forces fleeing to Washington, but also convinced both sides to prepare for long war. The 1862 Peninsula Campaign saw George McClellan's massive Union army advance on Richmond, only to be turned back by Robert E. Lee's aggressive 7 days battles. Lee's victories at Second Manassas and Fredericksburg established his reputation, but his invasions of the North failed at Antietam and Gettysburg. The 1864 Overland Campaign brought unprecedented carnage. Ulysses Grant, unlike previous commanders, wouldn't retreat after tactical defeats. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor saw horrific casualties, over 100,000 combined in 6 weeks. Grant's siege of Petersburg, Richmond's supply line, lasted 9 months. The Shenandoah Valley saw devastating warfare. Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Valley Campaign remains a military masterpiece, but Philip Sheridan's 1864 campaign deliberately destroyed the valley's agricultural capacity, presaging Sherman's march through Georgia. The home front. For Virginia civilians, war meant suffering. Armies consumed or destroyed crops and livestock. The Union blockade created shortages of everything: salt, medicine, clothing. Richmond bread riots in 1863 saw desperate women looting stores. Enslaved Virginians seized freedom when possible. Thousands escaped to Union lines, with men often joining the United States colored troops. Those remaining often refused to work or actively aided Union forces. Slavery collapsed wherever Union armies appeared. White women managed farms and plantations, worked in factories and hospitals, and faced sexual violence from soldiers of both armies. The war destroyed traditional gender roles along with much else. The end. By April 1865, Lee's army was starving and surrounded. Richmond fell on April 3rd, with Confederate officials fleeing and fires consuming much of the city. African Americans celebrated in the streets as Abraham Lincoln walked through the former Confederate capital. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. His dignified surrender and Grant's generous terms, Confederate soldiers could return home unmolested, helped prevent guerrilla warfare. Virginia was devastated. Richmond and Petersburg lay in ruins. The Shenandoah Valley was desolate. Railroads were destroyed, farms abandoned, livestock gone. A quarter of military-age white men were dead. The entire social and economic system had collapsed. Reconstruction and redemption. Military occupation and political reconstruction. Virginia remained under military occupation until 1870. Military District No. 1, commanded by General John Schofield, governed with relative moderation compared to other occupied states. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to assist formerly enslaved peoples transition to freedom, establishing schools, mediating labor contracts, and providing emergency relief. African Americans, with Northern missionaries' help, created hundreds of schools. Hampton Institute, founded in 1868, became a premier institution for African American education. The 1867 Constitutional Convention included 24 African American delegates among its 104 members. The resulting Constitution mandated public education, granted universal male suffrage, and guaranteed civil rights, regardless of race. African American political participation. During Reconstruction, African Americans voted in large numbers and held numerous offices. Virginia elected several African American congressmen, and dozens served in the legislature. African Americans served as sheriffs, justices of the peace, and city councilmen throughout the state. This political participation brought tangible benefits: schools, legal rights, and human dignity. But it also provoked violent white resistance. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black voters and white Republicans. Economic coercion, threatening to fire or evict blacks who voted Republican, supplemented outright violence. The end of Reconstruction. The Conservative Party, later Democrats, regained control through a combination of violence, fraud, and appeals to white solidarity. The 1869 election saw conservatives ally with moderate Republicans to defeat the more radical Constitution. By 1871, conservatives controlled the legislature. The Funding Act of 1871 redirected school funds to pay state debts, devastating public education. The poll tax, enacted in 1876, disenfranchised poor voters of both races, but especially African Americans. The rise of Jim Crow. The 1902 Constitution effectively eliminated African American political participation through poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses. The number of registered black voters fell from about 147,000 to under 10,000. Segregation laws separated the races in schools, trains, streetcars, theaters, and public accommodations. Separate but equal meant separate and desperately unequal. Black schools received a fraction of white schools' funding. Many counties provided no high school education for African Americans. Lynching enforced this racial hierarchy through terror. Between 1880 and 1930, mobs murdered at least 85 African Americans in Virginia, often for alleged crimes like talking back to whites. The New South and Progressive era industrial development. Despite political regression, Virginia's economy slowly modernized. Railroads expanded dramatically. Norfolk and Western, Chesapeake and Ohio, and others opened coal fields and connected ports to interior markets. Coal mining transformed Southwest Virginia. Towns like Big Stone Gap and Norton emerged almost overnight. Miners, including recent European immigrants and African Americans, worked in dangerous conditions for company scrip redeemable only at company stores. Tobacco manufacturing concentrated in Richmond and Danville. Cigarette production, mechanized in the 1880s, created new fortunes. Newport News Shipbuilding, founded in 1886, would become the nation's largest shipyard. Textiles emerged as another major industry. Danville became a textile center, with mills drawing rural whites into industrial wage labor. Mill villages, with company-owned housing and stores, recreated rural paternalism in industrial settings. Progressive reforms. The Progressive era brought modest reforms to Virginia. Governor Andrew Jackson Montague, 1902 to 1906, improved roads and schools, though reforms primarily benefited whites. The temperance movement culminated in statewide prohibition in 1916, 4 years before national prohibition. Women's suffrage advanced slowly in conservative Virginia. The Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, founded in 1909, faced fierce resistance. Virginia didn't ratify the 19th Amendment, though women gained the vote when it became national law in 1920. Some progressives challenged racial injustice. The Commission on Interracial Cooperation, founded in 1919, brought together moderate whites and blacks to address specific problems, though never challenging segregation itself. World War I. World War I transformed Virginia. Military bases like Camp Lee trained hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Newport News Shipbuilding built vessels for the war effort. Hampton Roads became a major embarkation point for troops heading to Europe. African Americans hoped military service would bring recognition and rights. Over 20,000 black Virginians served, many in combat roles, but returning veterans faced renewed violence and discrimination, sparking the Red Summer of 1919. The war accelerated social change. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Federal spending boosted the economy. Contact with the wider world challenged provincial attitudes. Depression, war, and transformation. The Great Depression. The Depression hit Virginia hard, but perhaps less catastrophically. than states more dependent on single industries. Tobacco prices collapsed, but demand remained steady. Coal mining suffered severely, with unemployment reaching 80% in some counties. The New Deal brought unprecedented federal intervention. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed thousands of young men, creating Shenandoah National Park and other facilities. The Tennessee Valley Authority extended into Southwest Virginia. Rural electrification transformed farm life. Harry F. Byrd, governor from 1926, 1930, and dominant political figure for decades, accepted federal aid while resisting federal control. His pay-as-you-go fiscal conservatism kept state services minimal but avoided debt. World War II. World War II transformed Virginia more than any event since the Civil War. Military installations expanded enormously. Norfolk Naval Base became the world's largest naval installation. Fort Belvoir, Quantico, Fort Lee, and other bases trained millions. Hampton Roads became the arsenal of democracy. Newport News Shipbuilding built aircraft carriers and battleships. The Radford Arsenal produced explosives. Women and African Americans entered industrial jobs previously denied them. The war brought prosperity, but also tensions. Housing shortages, racial conflicts, and social disruption accompanied rapid growth. German prisoners of war, housed in camps throughout Virginia, often received better treatment than African American citizens. Massive resistance. The Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision ordering school desegregation provoked Virginia's massive resistance. Senator Harry Byrd coined the term, organizing Southern opposition to integration. The 1956 legislature passed laws to close any school under integration orders. Prince Edward County closed its entire public school system from 1959-1964 rather than integrate. White students attended private academies. Most black students received no formal education for 5 years. Massive resistance ultimately failed. Federal courts ordered schools reopened. Business leaders, fearing economic damage, opposed school closures. White parents in Arlington and Norfolk wanted public schools, even integrated ones. The Civil Rights Movement. Virginia's Civil Rights Movement combined legal challenges, economic boycotts, and direct action. The NAACP, led by lawyers like Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, filed countless lawsuits challenging segregation. In 1960, students from Virginia Union University began sit-ins at Richmond department stores. The protests spread throughout the state, eventually integrating many public accommodations. The 1963 March on Washington included many Virginians. Danville's bloody police suppression of protests that summer gained national attention. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally ended legal segregation and restored African American voting rights. Change came gradually and incompletely. School integration proceeded slowly, with many districts not fully integrating until the 1970s. Housing and employment discrimination persisted, but the legal architecture of Jim Crow had finally fallen. Modern Virginia political transformation. The Voting Rights Act transformed Virginia politics. African American voter registration surged. In 1989, L. Douglas Wilder became the nation's first elected African American governor, a milestone unimaginable decades earlier. Virginia evolved from solidly Democratic to competitive two-party state to recently Democratic-leaning. Northern Virginia's growth created a politically moderate, diverse electorate that reshaped state politics. The old Bird Machine's rural, conservative dominance ended. Economic transformation. Virginia's economy diversified remarkably. Northern Virginia became a technology corridor, home to internet companies, defense contractors, and telecommunications firms. The Pentagon, CIA, and numerous federal agencies made government Virginia's largest employer. Hampton Roads remained dominated by military installations and shipbuilding, but added tourism, healthcare, and education. Richmond transformed from tobacco and manufacturing to finance, healthcare, and biotechnology. The Port of Virginia became the East Coast's third largest port. Agriculture evolved from tobacco to diverse products: poultry, cattle, soybeans, corn, and increasingly, wine. Virginia's wine industry, virtually non existent in 1970, now includes over 300 wineries. Demographic revolution. Virginia's population exploded from 3.3 million in 1950 to over 8.6 million today. Northern Virginia, virtually rural in 1950, became a massive suburban expanse. Fairfax County grew from 98,000 to over 1.1 million residents. Immigration transformed Virginia. Latinos became the fastest growing demographic. Asian immigrants, particularly in Northern Virginia, brought entrepreneurship and diversity. By 2020, Virginia had become majority minority in many jurisdictions. This diversity brought challenges and opportunities. Schools adapted to dozens of languages. Restaurants and businesses reflected global cultures. Politics became more complex, but also more representative. Educational excellence. Virginia developed outstanding educational institutions. The University of Virginia and William and Mary gained international recognition. Virginia Tech became a major research university. George Mason University, founded in 1957, emerged as a significant institution. Community colleges, organized into a statewide system, provided accessible higher education. Thomas Jefferson's vision of public education, so long denied to many, finally approached realization. Contemporary challenges. Modern Virginia faces significant challenges. Income inequality has widened. Rural areas struggle with poverty, inadequate health care, and opioid addiction. Urban areas face affordable housing crises and transportation gridlock. Racial reconciliation remains incomplete. The 2017 Charlottesville white supremacist rally shocked the nation. Confederate monuments removal sparked fierce debates about history and memory. Educational disparities persist along racial and economic lines. Environmental challenges loom large. The Chesapeake Bay requires constant protection. Climate change threatens coastal communities. Balancing economic growth with environmental protection remains contentious. The ongoing story. Virginia's history is America's history in microcosm. Indigenous civilizations destroyed by European colonization, democracy, and slavery emerging together. Civil war and incomplete reconstruction. Industrialization and resistance to change, and ongoing struggles for justice and opportunity. From Jamestown's desperate colonists to today's diverse communities. From tobacco plantations to technology corridors. From massive resistance to electing the nation's first African American governor, Virginia has embodied American contradictions and possibilities. The state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, speaks to Virginia's revolutionary heritage and ongoing struggles for freedom. That struggle continues as Virginians work to create a commonwealth truly representative of all its people. Virginia's story reminds us that history isn't past but living, in ongoing debates about monuments and memory, in persistent inequalities rooted in historical injustices, in institutions and ideas born centuries ago that still shape daily life. As Virginia moves forward, it carries this complex history, burden and inspiration, warning and promise. The challenge for contemporary Virginians is to honestly confront their history while building a more equitable future, to honor what was noble in their past while acknowledging what was shameful, to preserve valuable traditions while embracing necessary change. The history of Virginia teaches us that progress is possible, but never inevitable, that freedom requires constant vigilance, that diversity is a strength when coupled with justice, and that the work of building a more perfect union is never complete. From the Powhatans, who first called this land home, to the newest immigrants making Virginia their home today, from the enslaved who built Virginia's wealth to their descendants still seeking full equality, from the founders who articulated revolutionary ideals to modern Virginians working to fulfill them. This is Virginia's story, and it continues to unfold. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Virginia's remarkable history. The story we've told today is far from complete. It's a story still being written by the millions who call Virginia home, each adding their own chapter to this ongoing narrative of struggle, transformation, and hope.